from the International School at Tel Aviv University, you're listening to Rihla, the podcast of the MA in Middle Eastern Studies program. Rihla is the Arabic word for travelogue. The Rihla Podcast brings you stories of our students' journeys as they live and study in Tel Aviv and travel throughout Israel and the wider Middle East. This episode of Rihla is part of the Alumni Spotlight Series. From time to time, we'll catch up with graduates of the program, find out what they've been up to, and discuss their areas of expertise. As a master's student in Middle Eastern history at Tel Aviv University, Heidi Basch-Harod discovered her passion for studying the stories and struggles of Middle Eastern women. Today, Heidi is the executive director of Women's Voices Now, a gender rights NGO that promotes freedom of expression. Women's Voices Now puts on short film festivals around the world, screening the work of filmmakers from Muslim-majority societies.
We travel the world bringing our films to different audiences, whether at universities or community centers, refugee camps, and sometimes the films challenge status quo. Sometimes they reflect the challenges that women are facing in these societies. What we're trying to do here is allow for different points of view to become known, to be discussed, to be thought about. And if there is a woman out there who'd like to see her life lived differently, that she knows that there's an international community behind her, supporting her, listening to her, and hoping that her future will be brighter and that she's going to have the tools one day to make it so.
So on a very basic level, what do we mean when we say women's rights?
I think that there's an enormous discourse about women's rights, human rights, whether they're universal, whether they're relative. The discourse has gone back and forth. It's been co-opted and occupied by different nations and different powers and agendas. But for me, when we say women's rights, it's the right to choose. And I'm not talking about abortion. I'm talking about the right to choose who to love, who to marry, whether or not to marry, to pursue an education, to be a mom, to have the right to leave your home and go grocery shopping, to choose what you buy when you go grocery shopping. Just the daily choices that so many women in the world make without even thinking twice. But even that many more women do have to think twice before they make those choices. So women's rights, they're human rights, universal human rights, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of association. For some reason, these things do not apply to women, and women are seen as possessions in their society, all societies. This is not, no one is excluded from this point of view of women. But ultimately, to give women their independence as human beings, that they are not possessions and they have agency to make the decisions in their life and to not suffer any harm for making those choices.
When we talk about women's rights in Muslim majority societies, which specific abuses and issues are we talking about? Like, can you give me a little kind of a taxonomy of women's rights issues in Muslim majority societies?
So women's rights in Muslim majority societies, we're talking about the right to choose who to marry and when, the right to choose when and how many children to have, the right to freedom of religion. Because with Women's Voices Now, we're not only talking about Muslim women, we're talking about all women in Muslim majority societies, Jewish, Christian, Druze, Baha'i, you name it, because there's, of course, extra problems for minorities within minorities. Freedom of association, political participation, access to education, to health services, to use of language, using the mother tongue, all of those things, freedom from fear of sexual terror and torture at the hands of government authorities in conflict zones, the worst things domestic violence, and the list goes on. But there's absolutely certain things in Muslim majority societies that you can use against a woman that can have a very immediate effect on whether or not she's able to continue the work she's doing, and they know what they're doing. They know that to shame a woman, to cause damage to her honor, that woman is grown up in a society where she's not necessarily an individual. She's part of a family, a clan, a tribe, a city. She doesn't only represent herself, and they know that that's how to hurt a woman and how to stop her from going forth. And so that's specifically a woman's rights abuse. And then there's another thing too, that with Women's Voices Now, because we're not dealing specifically with economic empowerment or political representation, we're talking more about what happens when you just start talking and sharing your story. So we're talking art and film. Expression can be very, very controversial. So what happens when a woman gives her take on what her society is doing? It can cause very serious repercussions. It can be shameful. It can feel, well, who is she anyway? But the fact is, who is she anyway? She is someone, and she does have a voice, and she does have a story. And that's her experience. And why isn't it valid?
You mentioned honor. Mm-hmm. Can you go into that a little bit more?
Well, what I can best do is use the example of Kurdish women, because this is my background of what I've studied. So in the situation of Kurdish women, very often there is a problem, and I specify this is prevalent in Iraq and in Turkey, Syria, Iran, but I know Turkey specifically, honor killings happen quite often. And what happens in these societies is that a woman has this honor that her body represents. It's literally about her body. And that body is expected to carry out certain behaviors. And when those behaviors are not carried out, which means building a home, taking care of children, being subservient to a husband, then the honor is violated. A woman seen holding a man's hand who she is not related to or is not in a formal relationship that's recognized by the community. These are the different ways in which honor is breached. And when honor is breached, there's a series of repercussions that can happen, which is ultimately could lead to her death. Brothers, uncles, sons, they're usually the ones who are given the responsibility to take this out. And again, it's important to mention, I think what we don't understand from societies outside of Muslim majority societies, this idea that honor is a collective asset and women represent that collective asset. So a woman doesn't really have individual rights in that sense. So really she doesn't just represent it. What's the big deal? Give a woman the right to education. Well, if her leaving the house wearing certain dress violates the honorable way in which a woman is supposed to appear in public, then the whole system starts to fall apart. And if the whole system falls apart, then what does that mean for the stability of the family or the clan? And if they don't have stability, then who are they in their larger community? So there's all these different pressures and different conceptions of how the woman should be behaving and acting. And it's all in the name of honor. And it's something that she represents, but she doesn't have the ability to protect for herself. It's the men's responsibility to preserve the honor. And to me, I can't think of anything more tragic. We all want to take responsibility for our actions. But in that context, you're not even allowed to take responsibility for yourself. And it kind of says to you, you really don't matter. What you do will always be judged by someone else. And what does that do to the soul? I can imagine that you feel like you just don't matter. And no matter what you do, right or wrong, ultimately someone else is going to pass the judgment on you.
You're bringing up this idea of individualism as opposed to being more community-oriented. And individualism is a very Western idea. So are we imposing Western ideas on non-Western societies?
The biggest thing for me working in an organization like Women's Voices now is I talk to all of my interns about this, we do not set an agenda. We do not impose our ideas. We are mainly reflecting and mirroring what we're hearing from women in these societies. It's not about us telling them, if you do X, Y, and Z, your lives will be better, you will be free. This is about us listening to their voices, listening to what they have to say, what they have issue with, and what they take issue with in their societies, and seeing how they think that these problems can be addressed. And the reason I even call them problems is because they themselves are calling them problems. And I think the biggest testimony of the truth of that statement is that in February, there was the 1 Billion Rising movement that began, where a group of women came up with an agenda and statistics showing that 1 in 3 women throughout the globe, across the globe, no country excluded, no society excluded, suffer from violence, whether it's rape, domestic abuse, violence perpetrated against them by police, by government authorities, whomever it is. This is a terrible, awful statistic. And the fact that women in Muslim majority societies were behind this, and you saw protests and demonstrations and flash dance mobs and videos coming from Khartoum, from Cairo, from Tehran, from London, from Stockholm, from San Francisco. This is a global movement we're talking about. So no, there's nothing to impose. This is what the women are saying. This is what we want. And even if there is an imposition, Who cares? That's how the discussion starts. That's the discourse. This is what we've been doing for the last 30, 40 years, is we've been arguing about what is it to be a woman? What does it be to be a free woman? Is freedom, is there a universal definition to freedom? We've gone back and forth. Yes, no. The point is the discussion is happening, and there's no women who want to be excluded from that discussion. So no, it's not an imposition, it's a discussion. We learn from our mistakes in the past, we move forward, we find the allies among us, and that's how we hopefully make progress as defined by the women who say, I want my life to be different.
Have women's rights in Muslim-majority societies deteriorated or gotten better over the last 100 years, let's say?
From the research I've done, the things I've read, films I've seen, people I've talked to, I think 150 years ago, there wasn't a discussion on women's rights. There was nothing to talk about. Things were what they were. The world was a very different place. Around the time of World War I, and the advent of nationalism and self-determination, you saw the advent of the woman question. And that was very popular in the Ottoman Empire. It was popular in Europe, in the United States. What is the women question? What is the role of women in society? Many groups, ethnicities, burgeoning nations would use the woman question to get support from the West, who was looking to support stable movements that would reflect the values of Western society, et cetera, and so on. So I would say that's really when the discussion about women began. I would not call it a discussion of women's rights. The woman question was posed by men. The agenda was written by men. They had token women who represented women. But I don't think women at all were really affected by this. With independence did come a discussion of women's rights. Quotas were put in place. The discussion of the role of Islamic law with national law, personal status, all of these things did start to address women, but this was very much imposed from the top. It wasn't coming from the bottom. Women who were educated, who knew how to read, who came from wealthy families, those were the only women who really were able to access any of the benefits from the very superficial changes that were taking place for women. And a very popular thing with the women's rights issue was to wrap it up in the nationalist struggle, whether it was Iran in the Islamic Revolution, or with the Kurds with their ethno-national struggle against Turkey, or earlier on in Algeria with their independence movement. You saw how women were mobilized, brought into the discussion, brought into the battlefield even in the name of we're going to make your lives better, and then the goals were accomplished and the women were pushed to the sideline. In many cases, their rights were even rolled back. We hear this all the time in the news, we know this. Many women stood up, many women demonstrated, many societies were created, publications were made that started, I think, throughout the 20th century, but I couldn't say that women's rights in general really improved. But what the Arab Spring brought to our attention is that women have been working very hard to maintain their rights, to progress, to advance their rights. And I wouldn't say that they have improved yet either. But I think what's happening now, which is the most exciting thing and why I have great hope for the future, is that, again, it goes back to that shame and honor. The tools that used to be used to intimidate women to not fight for their rights as women and not latch on to another political agenda, those are no longer effective. Women are saying, yes, embarrass us. Give us virginity tests. We're going to tell. We're going to tell. You do something like that to us, we're going to go out there. We're going to make a stink about it. We're going to get the whole world about it. Whoever will listen to us, the religious, the secular, we're going to talk about this stuff. And you're not going to use that to push us into silence anymore. And forget your political agenda. Right now, starting in the 21st century, I think we're moving toward a future in Middle Eastern societies and Muslim majority societies where women are fighting really and truly for themselves and their rights. I hope their rights will come. I don't know. I think it's a very big task, but I'm encouraged by what I see, that they're not giving up and they're fighting in their name and not on another ballot.
What are some of the roadblocks to women's rights?
I think there's a few roadblocks. One, the percentage of women who are educated and who could represent themselves and come from communities that would support them are very few still. It's really the upper echelons of society. Sure, you have, let's say, rural Morocco, you have carpet making co-ops and bread making co-ops, but that doesn't necessarily translate to women going to the capital and demanding their rights for what they want. Or I even hear from one of my interns who's in Morocco now for our global tour that one of of the most frustrating things about the women's empowerment movement in Morocco is that you have all of these organizations, but they're all fighting for resources. There isn't enough money coming from the government to provide for each of them, so they end up competing with themselves. So not only is the need not being met, there may be enough women who are ready to start changing their environments, who want to become more economically empowered and have the way to do that, the plan, but there's enough money to fund these things. And that's something the government should be funding, because it's ultimately for the better of the entire society. So the roadblocks are just inadequate attention, inadequate funding, not enough women, maybe not enough of a critical mass to make things happen really and truly. I think another tremendous roadblock is, for example, let's say the United States gives millions and billions of dollars to Muslim majority societies collectively through aid programs, foreign policy initiatives, etc. I am not so sure that that money anywhere in that policy is that money contingent upon whether or not you're advancing the women in your society. Are you providing them with education? Are you enforcing the laws you already have about child brides, about forced marriages, about divorce, polygamy, all of those issues? So there is still a lack of international support for the women's movement, that's for sure. And then you have the government's inadequate support for their own women's movements, the NGOs that have been started within those countries. And then, of course, you have this growing movement of political Islam, and political Islam very much likes to use women and whether or not they are contained as the measuring stick of how much power they have.
What do you mean contained?
Contained, meaning things shouldn't change, meaning women are in the home, women are dressing a certain way, women are acting a certain way, women have very specific role in society, and that is dictated by men. And as soon as that starts to change, there's trouble.
Which aspects of Islam make it difficult to advance women's rights or expand women's rights?
Okay, I'm not a Quranic expert in any way, shape, or form, but I'll use the example of Afghanistan. I would say that in Afghanistan, it isn't about Islam. It's about ignorance. We have a publication at Women's Voices now, which is called The W Voice, and a few months ago, it was about the bride price in Afghanistan, that there's this tradition that when a family goes to ask for the hand in marriage for their son, for someone else's daughter, that part of the negotiation that goes on is it's called a mar. It's a dowry, bride price. Well, in fact, dowry doesn't exist in Islam. And in fact, this bride price is meant to go to the bride, and it's supposed to be her social security in the event that the husband dies, in the event that she needs something extra. It's her money. It's something for her to do. And it's,
or if he divorces her.
And it's her way of feeling secure, because she is expected to stay in the home, et cetera, and so on. So what income is she going to have? So it's her nest egg. In Afghanistan, there's no awareness that the fact that the bride price goes to the families, the bride price goes to the mother and father, and not to the bride, is completely against Islam. It's even forbidden in Afghani law. Very often, weddings in Afghanistan are so exorbitantly expensive, much more than the family can pay, that it actually turns into this spiraling debt cycle that no one can pay for the weddings. And in the end, the bride has nothing, and who knows what's going to happen in her future. I don't think that Islam is really the challenge. I think Islam is definitely part of the solution, in fact, but Islam needs to be studied. The laws, the rules need to be studied by women. People who don't have education, poor people in villages, remote places, they're told this is what it is. This is what's expected. There's no questioning going on. So they hear it from their local imam that this is how it's supposed to be, but there's really no basis. They can't read the Quran for themselves anyway. So how are they supposed to know if it's true or false? But this is just the way it's done. So there's no asking the questions. So I don't think Islam is the obstacle. I think Islam could be the answer. And I think just like in Jewish texts, Jewish study, and studying Torah and Talmud, there's conversations and there's arguments and there's re-examining. And I think I know that that's starting to happen in the Muslim world. You have many women who are now interpreting the Quran. And so I don't think it's about Islam. I think it's about culture. It's about practice. It's about ignorance. It's about lack of education. It's about poverty. Those are the things that I think are contributing to the persistence of these rights abuses for women.
For a long time, women's rights activists have been working on issues of access to education, economic rights, political rights. but I think that trying to give women a platform on which to express themselves and what they're feeling and talk about their daily lives is a newer phenomenon.
It is. You're right. Yes. So what I can say about that from the research that I've done is in the 1980s, you could say that in the international development world, we started taking a look at women, the status of women, and decided that if the status of women is improved, then the overall status of economy and international relations can possibly improve. There's something to gain from investing in women. The 1995 Beijing Conference on Women documented specific measures and actions that the world could take. You have the Millennium Goals, so on and so forth. Starting around 2005, 2007, there began to be this conversation. There was this gender mainstreaming, equality, gender mainstreaming, right to access, like you said, education, employment, and so on. 2007, there started to be this discussion on, wait a minute, you mean women have to produce something in order to have their human rights respected? There has to be a high return on the investment. They need to choose to buy milk instead of beer when they go to the store in order to receive those rights. There's a problem with that because that means that we don't value women's rights just as on the basis of trying to promote human rights, that women have to produce and give something to society in order to be respected. And that really shouldn't be the case. The fact of the matter is we want to pursue women's rights because they're human and because as an international community, we've set international standards on basic human rights. We don't advocate for the rights of animals or people with disabilities because we're expecting them to contribute so much to society, to solve the world's problems. We do it based on the fundamental belief that we shouldn't harm people or animals, that we shouldn't be cruel to each other, that we need to have respect for life. So why doesn't that same idea apply to women's rights? So that discussion started happening in the latter half of the first decade of the 21st century. And you can see that that is continuing, that there is more discussion about freedom of expression and exploring what that means as well.
Wait, who was saying that women need to be productive members of society in order to have their human rights?
Well, any international project, any IMF or Global Fund or World Bank program that was put into place wanted to see a return on the investment. They got the economic world, the finance world involved too. So we want to see that this works. We want to see that if we give a micro loan to this community of women, that in 10 years' time, in fact, there will be electricity in the village and there won't be as much domestic violence, et cetera, and so on. But the correlation isn't so clear-cut. It doesn't really necessarily happen like that. And so what? If that doesn't happen, then you take those things away? Then women no longer have a right to work and to be financially independent, to make the decisions for their families? Like, it's a little contrived, I think, in my opinion. So what's before those economic rights? What comes before the political rights? You have to start talking about things. You have to be able to have ideas and discussions and to dream about the society that you want instead. Women weren't necessarily asked, how can we make your life better? We made assumptions it's about the money. It's about seeing the improvement financially, educationally. All of those things are important. We have to have all of those things. I'm not saying get rid of those programs in any way, shape, or form. But there has to be the other side, which is, it's cheesy, but it's about the soul. It's about what happens when you're allowed to just dream and think aloud and to imagine your future in another way. So what, every woman in Morocco has to learn how to sew a blanket to sell to a woman in the United States in order to have a right to make her own decision in her family life? No. If she wants to just sit in a cafe somewhere all day and write poetry or just sit in that cafe, she should have a right to do that too. Her value isn't contingent upon what she can produce for society. And I don't think it's a bad thing, but I'm sure many people would disagree that I think it's a good thing to be able to say, this is what I want for my life. I'm going to go and get it. The obstacles along the way will be the obstacles that come from me. What am I capable of doing? What am I capable of pursuing? What am I really passionate about? I think this is a very evolved way of thinking and an evolved way of living one's life. And if there are women in other societies, and if we're talking about Muslim majority societies who also want to have that future, for some reason, I take it as my responsibility to help them get there in whatever small way I can, and to connect them with each other and to let them know it's possible, that anything is possible. It maybe takes hundreds of years, but we have to start somewhere.
You started explaining why it's important to give women the right to express themselves, even before giving them the right to work outside the home, to get an education, to enter politics. Can you continue?
Elaborate on that? I think it's about speaking for oneself. You have to be able to speak for yourself. I think that's the bottom line. What if a woman doesn't want to have the right to go work in a co-op and make bread for the community? Maybe she is very happy to stay in her home and to raise her children. You know, yes, it is true. The Western world does go into these societies and say, look, this is what's worked for us, and this is how women are in our society. So we know that if we put this model on you, the same improvements are going to come. Nothing could be further from the truth, because everyone has a different experience. You can't implement one model onto another situation, expect the same outcome. So you have to take the context, and you have to listen to the voice that says, but I know what my life is, and I know what I'm looking for. And if a woman's only option is to make the bread and weave the carpet, well, then you're still stifling her person, her agency. So that's why it's important to be able to express, I do want to live in my home. I don't like so much that I'm beaten by my husband when the money doesn't come in at the end of the month. And I would love to know why he's not allowed to do that, even though I'm told that he's allowed to do that by a religious leader or an elder or my husband himself. So it's about refining the conversation and getting more down to what does a woman need and what does a woman want as a human being. For me, I think that's why the freedom of expression should come first. And once that woman can articulate the life that she wants to lead, then I think we start forming the programs and the crisis interventions and all of those things. I think that's a good way to approach these places and people.
Thanks for listening to the Rihla Podcast. We have more episodes coming out soon, so stay tuned. For more information on the MA in Middle Eastern Studies program and how to apply, visit mames-israel.org. That's mames-israel.org. The Rihla Podcast is produced by Shoshi Shmulevitz.